They could stop wars without a sword. Their words held more power than kings, yet history nearly erased them. Who were these mysterious Celtic priest kings, feared by empires, bound to ancient forests, and whispered about for centuries? What secrets did they guard, and why did they vanish so completely? This is the untold truth behind the Druids, the most powerful people you've never really known. The Druids were the learned elite of the Celtic peoples. They combined roles we'd now split between judges, professors, priests, and scientists. They emerged during the Iron Age, somewhere between 800 and 500 years before the Common Era, as Celtic peoples spread across Europe. So where does this class come from? Let's break their origins into three parts: their Indo-European roots, their emergence in written history, and their geographic spread. First, the Indo-European roots. The Celts were part of a larger family of peoples who spoke related languages. Scholars believe the Druids evolved from older shamanic traditions. As Celtic societies grew more complex, these spiritual specialists transformed into something more structured. The Druids retained spiritual functions, but added legal authority, astronomical knowledge, and political influence. Next, written history. Our earliest evidence comes from Greek and Roman writers. Around the 1st century before the Common Era, scholars like Posidonius travelled through Celtic lands and wrote descriptions. Later, Julius Caesar provided detailed accounts of Druidic practices. He described them as powerful figures who controlled ceremonies, settled disputes, and educated the young. Pliny the Elder wrote about their reverence for oak trees and mistletoe. The third part is geographic spread. The Druids operated across vast territory. In Gaul, modern France, they held significant power. In Britain, Druidic traditions ran deep. Ireland, never occupied by Romans, became perhaps the strongest preserve of Druidic learning. This reach tells us the Druids weren't just local priests. They formed a network that transcended political boundaries. When a young Celtic noble wanted the best education, he might study with Druids in distant lands. This movement strengthened the Druidic class as a whole. Despite lacking written texts, core teachings remained remarkably consistent across regions. The Druids emerge when Celtic societies are becoming more complex. They're developing metalworking, trade networks, and hierarchical structures. These societies need specialists. You need people to remember and interpret laws when nothing is written. You need intermediaries with the gods. The Druids filled these needs. In a small village, disputes can be settled by consensus. But as societies grow, you need formal systems. The Druids became that system. They were living libraries, walking law books, spiritual authorities that gave structure to a decentralized world. So the Druids emerged between 800 and 500 years before the Common Era among Iron Age Celts. They likely evolved from older shamanic traditions. We know them through Greek and Roman accounts. They spread across Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, forming a pan-Celtic intellectual elite. Their origins reflect society's need for legal authority, spiritual guidance, and educational continuity in a world without writing. Now that we understand where they came from, we can explore what they actually did. You might wonder why anyone would give so much power to priests and scholars. But understanding what Druids did shows why Celtic societies couldn't function without them. They were the glue holding communities together. The Druids were multifunctional specialists. They combined priests, judges, doctors, teachers, and scientists all in one. They were exempt from taxes and military service. Society needed them focused entirely on intellectual and spiritual duties. Let's break their role into three functions: religious authority, legal power, and advisory responsibilities. First, religious authority. The Druids were priests of the Celtic peoples. They oversaw all major ceremonies and rituals. Celtic religion was woven into daily life. Gods were present in every river, tree, and hillside. They influenced crops, battles, births. The Druids acted as intermediaries, speaking to the divine and interpreting divine will back to people. Seasonal festivals were particularly important. The Celts celebrated 4 major festivals: Samhain, Beltane, Lugnasad, and Imbolc. Each required Druidic oversight. The Druids were timekeepers, studying stars and sun to know exactly when each season began. The second function was legal power. In Celtic society, law and religion were inseparable. The Druids maintained oral legal codes memorized across generations. When disputes arose, Druids served as judges. Their decisions were final. They could impose fines or excommunicate someone from religious life. Without written law books, you need people trained in memorizing law. The Druids spent decades learning legal precedents. In a society without police or formal courts, Druids provided the only real justice system. The Druids also mediated disputes between tribes. The Celtic world was often violent, but Druids could declare truces and negotiate settlements. Because they operated across tribal boundaries and held religious authority everyone respected, they were perfect mediators. The third function was advisory and educational. Celtic kings relied heavily on Druidic advice. The Druids were the most educated people in society. They understood history, law, poetry, astronomy, medicine. Education was another crucial role. Young nobles studied under Druidic teachers for years. They learned poetry, law, history, science, philosophy. This happened entirely through oral transmission. Through education, Druids shaped values and knowledge of Celtic society. Consider how these functions interconnect. Imagine a tribe facing drought. Religious authority means Druids perform ceremonies for rain. Legal authority means they judge disputes over water rights. Advisory role means they counsel leaders. One crisis, 3 Druidic functions working together. The Druids held supreme moral authority over even kings. A king had military power, but a Druid could declare a king's actions unjust. This created checks and balances. The Druids represented law, wisdom, and divine order itself. The Druids served as priests overseeing religious life. They acted as judges maintaining oral law. They advised leaders and educated the young. These roles overlapped and reinforced each other. Without writing or formal institutions, the Druids were the institutions. They were the living framework holding Celtic civilization together. Having seen what they did, we can now explore how someone actually became a Druid. Ever wondered how someone gains knowledge to run an entire society's spiritual and legal life? The training of a Druid was one of the most demanding educational processes in the ancient world. It could take 20 years or more, with no shortcuts and no written notes. Becoming a Druid meant intensive, lifelong education focused on memorization. Students learned through oral transmission. The curriculum covered astronomy, law, poetry, medicine, philosophy, and religious ritual. By the end, a trained Druid carried an entire library's worth of knowledge in their mind. Let's break this into 3 aspects: duration and commitment, subjects covered, and teaching methods. Ancient sources tell us Druidic education could last 20 years or longer. From around age 10 or 12 until their 30s, students focus primarily on learning. This exceeds most modern professional training. Why so long? Because they had to memorize everything. In a literate culture, you reference books, but for Druids, their minds were the only repository. A legal case might require recalling precedents from generations past. A ritual might demand precise wording from centuries ago. All memorized. Students often left home to train in special centers, sometimes in sacred groves or remote areas. This isolation removed distractions. It built bonds between students from different tribes, reinforcing the pan-Celtic nature of the Druidic class. What exactly did aspiring Druids study? Astronomy was crucial. The Druids needed to track sun, moon, and stars to determine proper times for festivals. This was practical science necessary for an agricultural society. Law was another major subject. Students memorized entire legal codes. They learned precedents, rulings made by earlier Druids. By completion, they could serve as judges in virtually any dispute. Poetry held a special place. For Druids, poetry was a mnemonic device, encoding information for easier memory. Rhythmic, structured language is easier to memorize than prose. Historical accounts, genealogies, legal principles, even medical knowledge were taught in poetic form. Medicine was both art and science. Students learned to identify plants and their healing properties. Philosophy rounded out the curriculum. The Druids grappled with questions about existence, the cosmos, the meaning of life and death. How do you transmit this much information orally? Repetition was fundamental. Students heard the same material many times. A teacher might recite a legal code repeatedly until the student could recite it back perfectly. Storytelling and narrative structures helped encode information. Rather than isolated facts, knowledge was woven into stories. Stories are easier to remember because they engage emotions and create mental images. Rhythm and meter made poetry a powerful teaching tool. The human brain responds to patterns. When information follows rhythm or rhyme, it becomes easier to retrieve. A young person enters Druidic training. For the first few years, they focus on foundations. As they progress, material becomes more complex. By year 10, they are proficient, but not complete. By year 20, they've achieved mastery. This system produced individuals with mental capabilities that seem almost superhuman today. Ancient accounts describe Druids who could recite for hours without notes, recall obscure legal precedents instantly. These are natural results of training the mind intensively for decades. Druidic training lasted 20 years or more. The curriculum covered astronomy, law, poetry, medicine, and philosophy, all transmitted orally. Teaching methods included repetition, storytelling, and rhythmic poetry. The result was a class of individuals carrying vast libraries in their minds, ready to serve as priests, judges, healers, and advisors. With this foundation, we can now explore the sacred spaces where Druids practice their art. Where does the sacred live? For the Druids and Celtic peoples, divinity wasn't confined to buildings. It was everywhere in nature, in oak leaves, flowing rivers, and standing stones. Understanding how Druids worshipped reveals a spirituality rooted in direct engagement with nature. Celtic religion was fundamentally nature-based. The gods inhabited the natural world. A river might be a goddess, An oak grove might be a gateway to the divine. Mountains, springs, and certain trees were holy in themselves because divinity literally resided there. Let's explore 3 dimensions: sacred landscapes, symbolic importance of natural elements, and seasonal festivals. The Druids centered worship in specific natural locations. Oak groves were perhaps most important. The oak tree held special significance, seen as particularly beloved by the gods. A grove of ancient oaks became a natural temple. The trees themselves created sacred space. Rivers and wells were also holy sites. Water held profound spiritual importance. Many Celts made offerings at rivers, throwing valuable objects into water as gifts to gods. Wells were seen as portals to the underworld or divine realm. Stone circles and standing stones mark the Celtic landscape even today. The Druids used them as gathering places for major ceremonies. Imagine a community assembling at a stone circle at dawn on summer solstice, with Druids conducting ritual as the sun rises. Hills and mountains also served as sacred sites. Elevated places allowed you to occupy a liminal space between earth and heaven. 2 elements stand out: oak trees and mistletoe. The oak was the most sacred tree. It was strong, long-lived, and provided shelter and food. The Druids saw the oak as a channel for divine power. Mistletoe, particularly mistletoe growing on oaks, held special significance. This plant that grows without roots in the ground seems magical. It remained green through winter. The Druids harvested mistletoe in special ceremonies. The harvested mistletoe was used in healing rituals. Fire was another key element. The Druids used fire in purification rituals. Fire represented both destruction and renewal. Major festivals involved communal bonfires. Water represented life, cleansing, and connection to hidden realms. The combination of fire and water in ceremonies created a balance of opposing forces. The Celtic year revolved around 4 major festivals, each marking a turning point in the agricultural cycle. The Druids determined exact timing based on astronomical observations. Samhain occurred around the beginning of November. It marked the harvest's end and winter's beginning. This was a liminal time when the boundary between living and dead became permeable. The Druids led ceremonies honoring ancestors and protecting the community. Beltane, around the beginning of May, celebrated summer's start and land's fertility. This was a joyful festival focused on growth and abundance. Lugnasad, around the beginning of August, honored first harvests. The Druids conducted rituals of thanksgiving. Imbolc, around the beginning of February, welcomed spring's first stirrings. The Druids led ceremonies encouraging this return of light and warmth. Imagine it's approaching Samhain. The Druids determine the exact night. The community gathers at a sacred oak grove. As darkness falls, Druids light a massive bonfire, speaking words passed down for generations. The boundary between worlds feels thin. This is religion as direct experience. There's no separation between daily life and spiritual life. The river you fish in is holy. The forest where you hunt is divine. This creates a worldview where respect for nature is built into the core of religious practice. Celtic worship centered on natural sites: oak groves, rivers, wells, stone circles, and hills. Sacred elements like oak trees, mistletoe, fire, and water served as focal points. Seasonal festivals structured the religious year. The Druids orchestrated all of this, determining when and how to conduct ceremonies. Their religion was lived outdoors, with divinity experienced as immediate presence. Having seen where and how they worshipped, we can now examine how the Druidic class itself was organized. Who leads the leaders? Even among the Druids, there was structure and specialization. Understanding their internal organization reveals how Celtic society created a complex intellectual class with different roles. The Druidic class is divided into three primary orders: Druids proper, bards, and ovates. The Druids held the highest rank, serving as priests, philosophers, and judges. The bards were oral historians and poets. The ovates specialized in divination, prophecy, and healing. Within this structure, leadership existed, with some regions maintaining a high druid overseeing others. Let's break this into three areas: the three orders, leadership and hierarchy, and movement through these levels. The Druids themselves, the senior class, held the highest position. These were fully trained members who had completed the entire 20-year education. They performed the most important religious rituals, made the most significant legal judgments, and advised the most powerful kings. These individuals had mastered all areas of knowledge. The second order was the bards. These were the poets, storytellers, and musicians. Their primary role was preserving cultural memory through verse and song. In a culture without writing, the bards were the living archives. They memorized genealogies, historical events, and the deeds of heroes. When a community gathered for a feast, the bards performed, reciting the great stories that defined who the people were. This wasn't just entertainment. It was education and cultural transmission. The third order was the ovates. These specialists focused on divination, prophecy, and healing. They interpreted omens, read signs in nature, and predicted future events. They also practiced medicine. The ovates were the seers and healers. These three orders weren't completely separate. They worked together and often overlapped, but the distinction existed and allowed for specialization while maintaining a unified Druidic class. Within the Druidic class, there were ranks and seniority. Some Druids were recognized as more learned or more experienced. In some regions, particularly in Gaul, there was a high Druid who served as the supreme authority. The high Druid held enormous power. They could convene assemblies of Druids, make final decisions on religious matters, and serve as the ultimate judge. They were the face of the Druidic class in dealings with kings. Not all Celtic regions had a high Druid. In some areas, Druids operated more as equals. Leadership often depended on demonstrated knowledge and spiritual power. A Druid who could predict eclipses accurately, whose legal judgments proved wise, would naturally gain influence. Respect was earned through capability. How did someone enter and progress? Most students began training as children or young teenagers. A student might begin training with the intention of becoming a bard. If they showed aptitude in deeper spiritual matters, they might continue training to become a full druid. If they had talent for divination or healing, they might become an ovate. Some remained students their entire lives. Others excelled and became recognized quickly. Still others continued learning throughout their lives, eventually becoming elders and teachers. Consider how this hierarchical structure served Celtic society. The division into orders ensured all necessary functions were covered. Religious and legal matters went to the Druids. Cultural preservation went to the bards. Divination and healing went to the ovates. The existence of leadership provided organization and authority. When major decisions needed to be made, having a recognized leader was essential. It prevented fragmentation and maintained coherence of Druidic teaching across wide areas. The flexibility in training meant the system could adapt to individual talents. Not everyone had to become a full Druid. If your strength was poetry, you could excel as a bard. This specialization made the entire class more effective. The Druidic class divided into 3 orders: Druids proper as priests and judges, bards as poets and historians, and Ovates as diviners and healers. Leadership existed within this structure, sometimes with a high Druid. Movement through the orders depended on training and ability. This organization ensured all of society's intellectual and spiritual needs were met. With this internal structure understood, we can now explore the beliefs and rituals that define Druidic spirituality. What happens when we die? The Druids had profound answers, shaping Celtic spirituality in ways that influenced how people lived and understood their place in the cosmos. Understanding Druidic beliefs reveals a worldview where life and death were part of an eternal cycle. The Druids taught that the soul was immortal and that death was not an ending but a transition. They believed in reincarnation, the idea that souls moved from one life to another. This belief had profound practical effects. It made Celtic warriors famously fearless in battle, since death was merely a doorway. Let's explore 3 aspects: beliefs about the soul and afterlife, ritual practices and sacrifices, and understanding of balance between natural and supernatural worlds. The Druids taught that each person possessed an immortal soul that survived bodily death. If you knew you would exist after death, if you believed you might be reborn, you approached life differently. Death lost much of its terror. The afterlife in Druidic thought wasn't a single destination like heaven or hell. It was more complex. Some souls might rest in an otherworld described as a beautiful realm. Others might quickly return to new life. The core idea remained. Death was transition, not termination. This belief explains certain Celtic practices. Debts unpaid in one life might be settled in the next. Your current circumstances might reflect actions from a previous existence. This created a sense of continuity and cosmic justice. The Celts often buried people with goods they might need in the next life: weapons, jewelry, food, tools. They genuinely believed the deceased would use these items. The Druids oversaw funeral rites, ensuring the soul's safe passage. The Druids performed regular sacrifices to maintain harmony with the divine. These offerings ranged from symbolic gifts to animal sacrifices to, in rare cases, human sacrifice. Most sacrifices were simpler, offerings of food, drink, or valuable objects. The Druids determined what offering was appropriate. Fire, water, and mistletoe featured prominently in purification rites. Fire cleansed and transformed. Water washed away impurity. Mistletoe possessed special power to heal and protect. The Druids harvested it in carefully prescribed ways. The Druids conducted these rituals at sacred sites: oak groves, stone circles, springs. The location mattered. Performing a ritual in the right place, at the right time, with the right offerings, created maximum effectiveness. Seasonal rituals marked the turning of the year. Each festival required specific rites. These weren't optional social events. They were essential spiritual maintenance, keeping the community aligned with cosmic cycles. The Druids saw reality as 2 realms in constant interaction. The natural world we inhabit and the supernatural world of gods and spirits. These weren't separate. They interpenetrated and influenced each other constantly. This meant balance was crucial. If humans offended the gods through improper behavior or neglected rituals, the natural world suffered. Crops failed. Disease spread. Conversely, if humans maintained proper relationships with the divine, the natural world flourished. The Druids were the guardians of this balance. When something went wrong in the natural world, they diagnosed the spiritual cause. They prescribed remedies, perform this ceremony, make that offering. Imagine a community experiencing a terrible plague. The Druids would interpret this as a sign of spiritual imbalance. They might consult omens to identify the cause. Based on their diagnosis, they would prescribe solutions. They might conduct elaborate purification rituals. They might require the community to make substantial sacrifices. Throughout this process, they would remind people that maintaining proper relationships with the divine serves everyone's long-term interests. The Druidic belief created a worldview where everything was connected. Your moral behavior affected natural events. Natural events reflected spiritual realities. Death was not an ending. The past, present, and future were linked through reincarnation. Nothing existed in isolation. This holistic worldview gave meaning to life. You weren't just a temporary biological creature. You were an immortal soul temporarily inhabiting a body, part of a vast cosmic system. Your actions mattered for maintaining balance in this entire system. The Druids taught that the soul was immortal, moving through cycles of death and rebirth. They performed rituals and sacrifices using fire, water, and sacred plants. They understood reality as two interpenetrating realms requiring careful balance. These beliefs created a worldview where everything was connected, where moral obligations had cosmic significance, and where death was a transition. With these beliefs established, we can now examine how Druids wielded political power. How much influence can a priest have without actually wearing a crown? The Druids demonstrate that moral and spiritual authority can sometimes exceed political power. Understanding their role in politics reveals how ancient societies created checks on rulers. The Druids held enormous political influence despite not being rulers themselves. They served as advisors to kings, guiding decisions on war, diplomacy, and governance. They mediated disputes between tribes. They could excommunicate individuals from religious life, a punishment so severe it effectively removes someone from society. Let's explore this power through three aspects: their advisory role, their function as mediators, and their authority through excommunication. Celtic kings rarely made major decisions without consulting Druids. Before declaring war, a wise king sought Druidic counsel. This wasn't just about spiritual guidance. The Druids were simply the most knowledgeable people available. They knew history. They could tell a king what happened the last time someone tried a similar strategy. They knew the law. They understood ritual and divine will. A king surrounded by Druids was a king with access to the best information available. The Druids also provided legitimacy. A king whose Druids publicly supported him gained credibility with his people. If the Druids declared that the gods favored a king's rule, resistance seemed impious. This created an interesting dynamic. Kings had military force and political authority, but Druids had moral authority and spiritual power. Neither could function optimally without the other. The Celtic world was fragmented into numerous tribes, often in conflict. But even in this environment, there were mechanisms for resolving disputes. The Druids provided those mechanisms. When two tribes had a dispute, they might agree to Druidic arbitration. The Druids would hear both sides and render a judgment. Because Druids operated across tribal boundaries and held religious authority everyone respected, their judgments carried weight even between rivals. The Druids could declare truces, periods when fighting must cease. Violating a Druidic truce brought spiritual consequences. You weren't just breaking a political agreement, you were offending the gods themselves. Peace negotiations often involved Druids as facilitators. Their presence made agreements more binding because breaking an oath witnessed by Druids meant risking divine punishment. This mediating function was crucial for Celtic unity. The Celts never formed a single unified empire, but they maintained cultural and religious unity across vast territories. The Druids were the primary mechanism enabling this unity. If a Druid declared someone excommunicated from religious life, that person became an outcast. They couldn't participate in sacrifices or festivals. They couldn't receive blessings. Other community members often avoided them. In a society where religion permeated every aspect of life, excommunication was devastating. You became spiritually unprotected. Your social relationships collapsed. It was social death without actual killing. The threat of excommunication gave Druids enormous leverage. Even powerful kings feared it. A king declared unfit by the Druids might find his warriors unwilling to follow him. The Druids didn't need armies. They had something potentially more powerful, the ability to withdraw spiritual legitimacy. Imagine a king growing tyrannical. The Druids would first advise him privately. If he continued, they might publicly question his behavior. If that failed, they might threaten or actually impose excommunication, effectively delegitimizing his rule entirely. This created a system of checks and balances. Kings had political and military power, but faced moral and spiritual constraints. The Druids couldn't directly rule, but could make ruling impossible for those who defied them. The Druids also maintained unity among Celtic tribes through shared religious identity. When tribes met for major festivals, the Druids presided. These occasions reinforced pan-Celtic identity. The Druids made this possible through their transcendent authority. The Druids wielded enormous political influence through advising rulers, mediating disputes, and holding the power of excommunication. They provided kings with knowledge and legitimacy. They arbitrated between tribes, maintaining Celtic unity. They could excommunicate individuals, effectively removing them from society. This combination made the Druids perhaps the most influential force in Celtic politics, despite not being rulers themselves. But this power would face its greatest challenge when Rome arrived. What happens when two civilizations with radically different worldviews collide? The encounter between Romans and Druids became one of history's great cultural confrontations. Understanding this clash reveals how empires suppress what they can't control. When Romans expanded into Celtic territories, they encountered the Druids and saw both a curiosity and a threat. Roman writers documented Druidic practices with fascination, but also horror. Over roughly a century, Rome systematically suppressed Druidism through military action and legal prohibition. The most dramatic moment came with the massacre at Anglesey in 60 CE. Yet Druidism survived in areas beyond Roman control. Let's break this into 3 parts: initial Roman encounters, deliberate suppression, and Druidic survival. Julius Caesar provided the earliest detailed Roman account in his writings about conquering Gaul in the 1st century BCE. He described them as a powerful priestly class who controlled education, performed sacrifices including human sacrifice, and wielded enormous influence. Caesar's account mixed respect with suspicion. He acknowledged Druidic knowledge, but also emphasized practices Romans found barbaric. This selective moral judgment justified Roman conquest as bringing civilization to barbarians. Romans saw the Druids as a threat for several reasons. The Druids provided unity to otherwise fragmented Celtic tribes. They could coordinate resistance across regions. They held moral authority that legitimized Celtic leaders. As long as the Druids remained powerful, Celts would resist full assimilation into Roman culture. Roman emperors recognized that controlling Celtic territories required breaking Druidic power. Emperor Tiberius began restricting Druidic activities. Emperor Claudius went further, officially banning Druidism around 40 CE. Banning Druidism meant prohibiting their gatherings, rituals, and teaching. Romans couldn't tolerate an alternative authority structure operating within their empire. Military action accompanied legal prohibition. Romans targeted sacred sites, particularly oak groves. Destroying these sites desecrated Celtic religion. The most dramatic suppression came at Anglesey in 60 CE. Anglesey was a major Druidic centre and source of continuing resistance. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a military campaign to eliminate this threat. Roman accounts describe Druids and Celtic warriors gathered on the shore. Druids raised their hands, cursing the invaders. Romans crossed the island and slaughtered defenders, including many Druids. They destroyed sacred groves, cutting down ancient oaks. They obliterated one of the most important centres of Druidic learning. The massacre at Anglesey marked the beginning of the end for Druidism within the Roman Empire. Yet suppression was never total. Druids who survived went underground or fled to regions beyond Roman control. The Romans never conquered all of Britain. They never conquered Ireland at all. Ireland, never occupied by Rome, preserved Druidic traditions longer than anywhere else. Irish sources from centuries later contain memories of Druidic practices, beliefs, and stories. Remote parts of Scotland also likely maintain Druidic traditions. However, survival came with costs. Cut off from the broader Celtic world, unable to gather freely, Druidism fragmented. The pan-Celtic unity it had provided broke down. The vast body of memorized knowledge began to erode. Roman suppression succeeded in its primary goal, breaking Druidic power as an organizing force for Celtic resistance. Even though Druidism survived in places, it never again functioned as it had before Rome. Consider the tragedy here. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, oral traditions stretching back generations, sophisticated understanding of astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy, all threatened with extinction. The Romans destroyed not just people, but an entire intellectual tradition. Here's an irony. The Romans documented Druidic practices even as they suppressed them. Without Roman accounts, we'd know far less about what Druids believed and did. The very empire that nearly destroyed Druidism preserved some memory of it through writing. Romans encountered Druids during conquest, viewing them with mixed fascination and hostility. Recognizing Druids as sources of Celtic unity and resistance, Roman emperors banned Druidic practices and launched military campaigns. The massacre at Anglesey marked the most dramatic suppression. Yet Druidism survived in Ireland and remote areas, though fragmented. The Roman suppression succeeded in breaking Druidic power, while inadvertently preserving some knowledge through Roman writings. This confrontation foreshadows the next challenge: Christianity. How does an ancient tradition disappear? Not always through violence, sometimes through transformation. The decline of Druidism shows how Christianity gradually replaced Celtic paganism, absorbing some elements while eliminating others. From the 4th through 7th centuries CE, Christian missionaries spread through Celtic lands. They converted Celtic leaders and common people, offering a new religious framework. As Christianity gained dominance, Druidic authority collapsed. Many Druidic functions were absorbed by Christian monks and priests. Sacred pagan sites were rebranded as Christian holy grounds. Oral traditions were written down by Christian scholars, though filtered through Christian perspectives. Let's explore this through 3 aspects: the conversion process, Christianity's absorption of Druidic functions, and indirect preservation of Druidic knowledge. Christianity arrived in Celtic lands through multiple paths. Missionaries, including famously St. Patrick in Ireland, offered a new religious vision: one God, salvation through Christ, written scriptures, and connection to a vast Christian world. For Celtic peoples, Christianity offered certain advantages. It provided literacy and access to written knowledge. It connected them to Mediterranean civilization. It offered a more personal relationship with the divine. It promised clear moral teachings codified in texts. The conversion of Celtic leaders was crucial. When a king converted, his people often followed. Christian missionaries targeted rulers. As leaders converted, the Druids lost their primary patrons and protectors. Kings, who once consulted Druids, now consulted Christian priests. Christian missionaries also directly challenged Druidic authority. They performed miracles, demonstrating divine power. They debated Druids publicly. They denounced Druidic practices as devil worship. The Druids faced a difficult position. Christianity challenged their authority on every level. Many Druids likely converted to Christianity themselves. Some probably joined monasteries. Others retired to remote areas. The Christian Church didn't completely replace Druidism. It absorbed much of what Druids had done. Priests replaced Druids as religious authorities. Christian law replaced Druidic legal codes. Monks became the new educated class. Christian festivals replaced or absorbed pagan ones. Where Druids had conducted seasonal rituals, Christians established holy days. Christmas absorbed winter solstice celebrations. Easter incorporated spring renewal themes. The Christian calendar became the new framework for marking time. Where Druids had maintained law, Christian ecclesiastical law took over many functions. Where Druids had been teachers, monasteries became centers of learning. Where Druids had been healers, Christian saints provided healing miracles. Sacred sites underwent transformation. Ancient springs that Druids had sanctified became holy wells associated with Christian saints. Oak groves had churches built nearby. Stone circles were Christianized through new legends. The landscape remained sacred, but under new management. Many Christian saints in Celtic regions show suspiciously Druidic qualities. Saint Bridget of Ireland has a tribute similar to the goddess Bridget. These stories suggest that pagan figures were retrospectively Christianized to smooth the transition. Monasteries became the new intellectual centers. Monks preserved not just Christian texts but also Celtic history, poetry, and lore. They wrote down oral traditions that Druids had memorized. In doing so, they saved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. We know about the Druids today partly because Christian monks wrote things down. Irish manuscripts contain stories of ancient heroes, legends of gods, legal codes derived from Druidic traditions, and references to Druidic practices. These texts are invaluable but problematic. The monks who wrote them were Christians. They modified stories to fit Christian morality. They portrayed pagan practices negatively. What survived is whatever Christians deemed acceptable to preserve. Still, enough survived to give us glimpses of what Druidism was. The Tambo Quailnge contains descriptions of Druidic magic, prophecy, and ritual. Legal texts preserve Druidic legal principles. Poetry maintains pre-Christian themes. Folklore preserve fragments in stories told around fires. Tales of fairy folk, otherworldly realms, and magic often contain echoes of Druidic cosmology. Popular practices like well-dressing and May Day celebrations maintained pre-Christian elements. Consider what was lost versus what was preserved. Lost were vast bodies of memorized knowledge that individual Druids carried. Lost was the training system. Lost was the living practice of rituals. Preserved were fragments, echoes, Christianized versions. The decline of Druidism wasn't simply Christianity replacing paganism. It was a complex transformation where new religion absorbed, modified, and preserved elements of the old, while eliminating what it couldn't accommodate. From the 4th through 7th centuries, Christian missionaries converted Celtic peoples, causing Druidism's gradual decline. The conversion of leaders was crucial. Christianity absorbed Druidic functions, with priests replacing Druids and Christian festivals replacing pagan ones. Sacred sites were Christianized. Christian monks preserved some Druidic knowledge by writing down oral traditions. The result was not complete destruction, but transformation, with echoes of Druidism surviving within Celtic Christianity. Yet this wasn't the end. Centuries later, new Druids would emerge. Can you recreate something ancient when you don't know what it really was? The modern Druid revival shows how nostalgia, imagination, and scholarship mix to reinvent traditions. Understanding this revival reveals how we construct identities from fragments of the past. In the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Britain and France, Romantic intellectuals became fascinated with ancient Druids. They saw them as noble savages and nature-loving philosophers. Some, like Iolo Morgan in Wales, fabricated elaborate rituals and texts they claimed were genuine. Neo-Druidic movements formed, creating organizations and developing modern practices. These modern Druids emphasized ecology, spirituality, and Celtic heritage. However, a significant gap exists between historical Druids and modern practitioners. Let's explore this through 3 aspects: the Romantic origins, the creation of neo-Druidic practices, and the relationship between scholarship and modern practice. In the 18th century, European intellectuals developed fascination with their ancient past. This was the age of Romanticism, emphasizing emotion over reason, nature over industrialization. Ancient Druids fit perfectly into this vision. They were seen as wisdom figures living in harmony with nature. This image was partly fantasy. Writers and artists portrayed Druids as white-robed sages performing ceremonies at Stonehenge, though there's no evidence historical Druids used Stonehenge. They emphasized nature worship while downplaying aspects like human sacrifice. Welsh scholar Iolo Morgan W.G. exemplifies this period. In the late 18th century, he claimed to possess ancient manuscripts containing Druidic teachings. He organized ceremonies and founded the Gorset of Bards. The problem? He fabricated most of it. His ancient manuscripts were his own compositions. Yet Morganwg's fabrications had a lasting impact. His Gorset became part of the Welsh Eisteddfod, a real cultural festival. His invented traditions were accepted as genuine for generations. Modern Druidism had been built partly on falsehoods. This pattern repeated elsewhere. People wanted to reconnect with ancient Druidism but lacked reliable information. So they filled gaps with imagination, claiming ancient authenticity for modern creations. Starting in the 18th century, various Druidic orders and organizations formed. Some were primarily fraternal organizations using Druidic symbolism. Others were genuinely religious, attempting to practice Druidic spirituality. The Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1791 in London, became one of the largest. Despite its name, it was entirely modern. It functioned primarily as a friendly society, providing mutual aid for members. Other groups took spirituality more seriously. The Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, founded in 1964 by Ross Nichols, focused on developing modern Druidic spiritual practice. It created training programs and rituals drawing on what was known about historical Druids, while acknowledging they were creating something new. These neo-Druidic groups developed distinctive practices. Many hold ceremonies at ancient sites like Stonehenge. They celebrate 8 festivals, the 4 historical Celtic festivals, plus the solstices and equinoxes. This 8-fold calendar is probably more modern than ancient. Modern Druids typically wear white robes, carry staffs, and use symbols like the awen, 3 rays of light representing inspiration. The white robes derive from Roman descriptions and romantic imagery. Many modern practices emphasize environmental consciousness. This reflects genuine historical nature worship, but also contemporary concerns about ecology. Modern Druids often position themselves as defenders of nature, protesting environmental destruction. This ecological emphasis resonates with people seeking spirituality aligned with environmental values. Modern Druidism is remarkably diverse. Some practitioners are polytheists worshipping Celtic gods. Others are more pantheist, seeing divinity in nature itself. Some blend Druidism with other traditions. This diversity reflects the lack of central authority. Academic scholars who study historical Druids and modern Druids who practice spirituality often have complicated relationships. Scholars emphasize evidence, acknowledging how little we actually know with certainty about ancient Druidism. Practitioners sometimes claim direct spiritual connection transcending historical evidence. Some scholars dismiss modern Druidism as historical fiction with no authentic connection. They point out fabrications, anachronisms, and inventions. From this perspective, modern Druidism is a contemporary creation, not a revival of something ancient. Other scholars take a more sympathetic view. They acknowledge modern Druidism is reconstructed and invented, but argue that all religious traditions evolve. Christianity today looks different from early Christianity. Why should Druidism be frozen in the past? Modern Druids themselves vary in their claims. Some honestly acknowledge they're creating new traditions inspired by ancient fragments. Others claim stronger continuity, believing they're recovering authentic ancient wisdom. The debate highlights a fundamental question. Who owns the past? Scholars argue for accuracy and evidence. Practitioners argue for living spiritual experience and the right to draw inspiration from history. Both have valid points. Consider what modern Druidism actually represents. It's a contemporary spiritual movement, drawing on fragments of ancient Celtic religion, filtered through romantic imagination, mixed with modern concerns about nature, and adapted to 21st century needs. It provides community, ritual, connection to nature, and link to Celtic heritage. Whether it's authentic depends on what you mean by authentic. It's not an unbroken continuation of ancient practice. Too much was lost, but it's authentically meaningful to practitioners. It authentically expresses certain values. The gap between ancient and modern Druidism is real and significant. Ancient Druids were Celtic priests operating in Iron Age societies. Modern Druids are contemporary spiritual seekers in industrial societies, celebrating nature and pursuing personal growth. The contexts are utterly different, yet connections exist. Both ancient and modern Druids emphasize nature as sacred. Both see themselves as preserving important wisdom. Both create community through shared ritual. These continuities, even if reconstructed, matter to practitioners. The modern Druid revival, despite its historical problems, has done something valuable. It's created a nature-centered spirituality accessible to modern people. It's preserved interest in Celtic culture. It's built communities around environmental values. These contributions have value regardless of authenticity debates. The revival also sparked serious scholarly interest in ancient Druids. As people became fascinated with Druidism, academics studied it more rigorously. Our understanding improved partly because modern Druids generated interest and questions. The modern Druid revival began in the 18th and 19th centuries as romantic intellectuals reimagined ancient Druids. Figures like Iolo Morgan fabricated rituals claimed to be ancient. Neo-Druidic organizations formed, developing modern practices emphasizing nature, ecology, and Celtic heritage. A significant gap exists between historical Druids and modern practitioners, with debates over authenticity. Scholars emphasize the invented nature, while practitioners find genuine meaning. The revival has created a contemporary spiritual movement, preserved interest in Celtic culture, and advanced scholarly understanding. Modern Druidism may not be what ancient Druids practiced, but is a real phenomenon addressing real needs in the modern world. The Druids, whether ancient or modern, remind us that humans continually seek wisdom, connection to nature, and communities of meaning. The ancient Druids emerged to meet Iron Age Celtic society's needs. Modern Druids emerged to meet contemporary needs for ecological spirituality and alternative religious paths. Both represent how humans create intellectual and spiritual systems to navigate their worlds. The ancient tradition may be largely lost, but its echoes continue reshaping themselves for each generation that seeks them.